Hi everybody, welcome back to the 50-hour-long epic Unity for J online vigil for Julian Assange. I am so proud and privileged to have here with me today CIA torture whistleblower John Kiriakou. This is a man who has literally changed the course of changed political discourse and had a humongous impact on what we know about what our governments have been engaged in our name and with our tax dollars. John, welcome to the stream.
Thank you very much. Glad to be back, Susie.
It's amazing to have you here. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
John, you have obviously really unique perspective and experience. And I had someone ask me earlier today if there was one of our guests who could talk about US and UK involvement in rendition programs specifically, and how this relates to Julian's situation had he not sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, or if he is handed over. In both cases, what are the kinds of threats that he faces?
It's a good question. There are different kinds of rendition first. There's just regular normal rendition. And that is, let's say I'm in Pakistan and I catch you and you're Canadian. I send you back to Canada. That's a rendition. Then there's extraordinary rendition. So we're in Pakistan. I catch you, you're Canadian, and I send you to Morocco. And I don't tell anybody, including the Canadian government. And God knows what they're going to do to you in Morocco. And then the Moroccans write a report with all of your confession, and they send it back to me. That's extraordinary rendition. Now, of course, that's, excuse me, that's illegal under international law, but it happens every day. It happens all the time. In Julian's case, I'm going to get a little bit bureaucratic here. In Julian's case, they wouldn't have dared to initiate an extraordinary rendition because he's Australian. And because he's Australian, that protected him. If he had been a citizen of virtually any other country in the world, they would have and they could have and would have done it. Because he's Australian, that protected him at least a little bit. With that said, his only option was to go into the Ecuadorian embassy. And it's because the fix was in. Now, everybody knows the fix was in. Everybody knows that this was not meant to be a fair process, right? He was set up from the very beginning. And so the only alternative to being arrested by British authorities and then immediately extradited to the United States was to go into the embassy. The problem that we've all run into here is that the US government has literally unlimited resources, and they can wait until the end of time. And that's what they've done while concurrently putting pressure on the Ecuadorian government. The last time we did one of these live streams, Susie, we talked about this. And the very next day on the front page of the Wall Street Journal was an article that was entitled, "Ecuador Tells US It's Open for Business." And the entire article was about how President Lenin Moreno, the new president of Ecuador, was seeking increased, enhanced trade ties with the United States, that they wanted to at least double the trade with the United States. Well, there's going to be a quid pro quo. And the quid pro quo is to throw Julian out of that embassy. I have no proof of that, but I'm confident that that's the case. This is about money. It's not about righteousness or truth or liberty or anything like that. It's about money. That's what Lenin Moreno has come down to. That's what I'm afraid of.
Now, if Moreno had gone the other way and had continued to protect Julian, what types of, not just threats, but actions do you think Ecuador would have taken against its state? And the reason I'm asking this is because we know about the cross-border incursions from Colombia. We know about the Ecuadorian journalists who were assassinated on that border. What do you think? How far would the US be prepared to go to pressure a country like Ecuador, who has essentially thumbed its nose at the US over the course of the last 6 years in sheltering Julian Assange?
I think they're willing to go quite far, actually. We've seen what they've done with other countries. You can begin with a downgrading of relations, which is not uncommon. You can reduce or freeze trade. I mean, goodness knows that the U.S. exports far more to Ecuador than Ecuador exports to the United States. And then you can begin a harassment campaign. You can encourage, for example, Colombians to cross the border. You can encourage a border conflict with a neighboring country. You can encourage people to reduce the level of their diplomatic relations. And so over the long term, there's a cost to this. I'm not saying that Moreno has nothing to lose by leaving Julian in the embassy. He does. There's a price to pay. I mean, we all make decisions that have consequences. We all make decisions where there's a price to pay. He's looked at that price and he appears to be deciding that it's too high. So there are a lot of little things that the U.S. can do that might result in a diplomatic difficulty for Ecuador, but they can't do anything that's terribly serious, and nor would they want to, I think, because if you look at the Julian situation, and then you weigh the entirety of U.S. Ecuadorian relations on the other hand, the entirety of the relations outweighs the Julian problem. And so I believe that Moreno is acting because of fear of the unknown. And that unknown is what the United States might do if he doesn't respond and if he lets Julian remain in the embassy. And I think that reaction really is an overreaction.
But then on the other side of the coin, what does Moreno stand to lose by cooperating with the US and by potentially kicking Julian out of the embassy by whatever means?
Nothing. He stands to lose nothing. In fact, if you look at it just in terms of raw numbers, he probably has a lot to gain. His relations will improve with the UK. They'll improve with the US, its major trading partner. I think he sees this as something that's not difficult to decide.
What about the loss to the status of Ecuador?
That's the thing. That to me and to you, that's important. I wrote an op-ed yesterday for reader-supported news about Ed Snowden, and I said that I would rather face another terrorist attack than to give up my civil liberties. Well, if I were Lenin Moreno, I would rather keep Julian in the embassy and maintain the world's opinion of me as a freedom fighter and someone who stands up for justice and liberty than to just raise my exports to the United States. To me, that's an easy decision.
Is there a chance, do you think, that Moreno was always intended to do what he's done, that it was an act of infiltration, that he came into and became, Korea's number two? And then, I mean, even Julian and WikiLeaks were saying, the best option is if Moreno becomes new president, et cetera, et cetera. Am I like a conspiracy theorist to think of that? Or do you think that he just had some change of heart once he was in power?
That's a great question. I don't think you're a conspiracy theorist. I think a lot of us were fooled by his first name, Lenin, right? I think that we all thought that here was a true leftist progressive. This was a guy who was going to maintain Ecuador's current policy, and he fooled us. And I think that infiltration is a possibility. I doubt that he just changed his mind overnight. I think he had thought this out and decided that once he was in office, he was going to implement this policy.
Because it wouldn't be the first example in human history of having a second in charge play nicely until the day comes that they're in power and then do a 180.
That's right. It happens all the time.
I think we've seen it in US politics as well,
Definitely.
historically.
Definitely, yes.
Okay, so moving on to Julian's physical situation now in the embassy. You talked a lot about the isolation that whistleblowers face when I last spoke with you. What is your take now? Because there's this really terrible catch-22 where Julian's health is degrading fast.
Yes.
And his doctors have acknowledged that there is a mortal risk to him in his current circumstances. And yet there may be an even bigger mortal risk to him leaving the embassy. I personally don't believe that the UK is going to treat him with kid gloves and wait to extradite him to the US. I think they've waited 8 years to get their hands on him, and I think the CIA will be on the first plane to London if Julian is in custody. That's my personal belief. I don't think they'll even wait till extradition. They will be interrogating him within minutes, is my personal belief. Where's the way out here? I mean, if he's at mortal risk in the embassy and if he's at mortal risk outside the embassy, where's the open window?
That's difficult. First, let's look at Julian's time inside the embassy. This is solitary confinement. You can describe it any way you want. Maybe he used to have some internet access. Maybe the food's a little better. But this is solitary confinement. It's not only solitary confinement, but it's solitary without the benefit of the 1 hour a day of exercise outside. So, of course, his health is going to degrade. That's in part what the US and UK governments have wanted to happen, because they knew that they could weaken him over time. And there's really nothing he can do about it. I mean, the guy never has direct sunlight. He's in danger of vitamin deficiencies and rickets and liver problems and kidney problems and everything else that comes with not being able to have sunlight to break down the vitamins in your body. Also, look at the mental and emotional situation that people in solitary confinement suffer from. It's not unusual. It's actually quite common for people in solitary to simply lose their minds. And we know this because we have very, very long-term solitary confinement here in the United States. In fact, the United Nations has declared the US practice of solitary confinement in US prisons as a form of torture and as a human rights violation. You know, we've had people in solitary confinement here in the United States for as long as 44 years. That's 44 years without human contact. 44 years without seeing the sun. That is certainly cruel and unusual punishment. The United Nations guidelines are that no one should remain in solitary confinement in one stretch for longer than 2 weeks. Julian's been in solitary for 6 years. So of course, that's going to take a toll on his physical and mental health. There's almost nothing that he can do to avert that. Let's couple that with his treatment by the British government before we even turn to the US government. The British government has been absolutely steadfast in their promise to harass and humiliate him the moment he walks outside that embassy. They have spent millions of pounds of the British taxpayers' money just to keep him inside that embassy, ringing it 24 hours a day. Why? The only crime that he's wanted on is failure to appear, which is something like a 50-pound fine. Well, we all know that that's nonsense. We all know why the British have that embassy ringed. It's to snatch him and to turn him over to the United States. I have to agree that if that happens, the CIA and the FBI are both going to be on that plane. And they're both going to be, they're both going to be at least attempting to interrogate him all the way back home. They will bring him back to the United States in chains because that's what they do. I said last time I did one of these live streams that the rumor here in Washington is that Julian has been secretly indicted in the Eastern District of Virginia. That's here where I live. It's based in Alexandria, Virginia. And they call the Eastern District of Virginia the espionage court because almost all national security cases are tried here. And the reason they're tried here is because this is the home of the CIA, of the Pentagon, and of almost every intelligence-related private contractor in the Washington area. So look who's going to be on the jury. It's going to be CIA employees, FBI employees, military employees or their spouses, intelligence contractors or their spouses. Julian couldn't possibly get a fair trial in a place like this. So they do it on purpose. Now, besides that, no national security defendant has ever won a case in the Eastern District of Virginia. It's called venue shopping. Even though no crime was actually physically committed in the Eastern District of Virginia, they know that the judges here are the toughest in America on national security cases, and so they would charge him here. You wouldn't charge him in New Mexico or California because he would probably be acquitted. So they charge him here in the Eastern District of Virginia. So my hope is something that's actually not even legal. My hope is something called jury nullification. Jury nullification is when a jury hears a case, the person violated the law, and the jury finds that the law is unfair. The law shouldn't be the law, that this is a miscarriage of justice. And so even though the government has been able to prove its case, the defendant is found not guilty. It's not guilty because the law is wrong and it's unfair. And that's really my hope for Julian. In the event that the worst case scenario actually comes to pass and he's extradited to the United States, I hope that there are 12 people or even one person, because in the United States, juries have to decide unanimously in federal cases. Just one person to say, wait a minute, this is wrong. It's wrong for this man to be prosecuted. And so I'm going to stand up and I'm going to say no. Now that'll result in a hung jury, and that's fine. He'll probably then be retried. But you can retry him over and over and over again. And if one courageous person says no, then eventually it's going to come to an end and he'll win.
So Daniel Ellsberg, when I spoke to him, firmly believed that Julian would be used to create case law, to create a legal precedent whereby a journalist had finally been successfully prosecuted, and that would then be used either as the stick or the threat, or to actually continue to prosecute other journalists. Chris Hedges and I talked about Hedges being party to the action against the NDAA, which was the Obama Indefinite Detention Act, which applied to American citizens. And Hedges talked about how when they tested that in court, the government was able to veto it. Essentially, what it came down to is that Hedges believes that there are already American citizens who are being indefinitely detained, who are not being given due process, who are not able to even be, they're not even given charges and tried in court. They are just literally indefinitely detained, the same as has been done to so-called foreign combatants prior to that. And certainly when we also touched on like the Chicago police black site, and there's other black sites in the United States where these arbitrary arrests and detentions have been occurring, which is along the same lines as NDAA. So what I'm thinking is there's two options. One is that they do prosecute Julian because they want to create the precedent, or two is that there is a danger that they might not prosecute him at all, that they might not even charge him, but that they'll indefinitely detain him. Do you think that's possible?
I think it's possible, but not likely. First of all, I think Chris Hedges is right, and I think Dan Ellsberg is right as well. Chris Hedges, in that we know from the ACLU that there is at least one American citizen being held indefinitely right now without being charged. We don't even know if he's being held in the United States, and we aren't entirely sure if he is just an American citizen or has dual nationality. There are rumors that he's a dual Saudi U.S. national and that he was scooped up on the battlefield in Syria. But you're right. The NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which Obama pushed, that allows for the indefinite, uncharged detention of American citizens, is in force as law. Americans no longer have to be charged with a crime. You can be held for the rest of your life incommunicado, die in prison, and no one knows that you were ever there. That's not the American way, but that's what we're doing. So Chris Hedges is right. Before I get to Dan Ellsberg, let me finish this thought. Julian is so high profile and has so many supporters and is Australian that I think that that's just not possible. If the Australian government likes him or not, it's irrelevant. They have to protect the rights of their citizens overseas. And so whether the Australian government likes Julian's politics or not makes no difference. They're going to have to weigh in with the US government on a consular level to make sure that his rights are being protected. So I don't see any scenario where Julian disappears into the system.
But are the Australians likely to do that? Because, I mean, really, they have not seemed to get, as we say, New Zealand, they don't seem to have given a toss about Julian for the last however many years. It's only very recently that they've actually, had any consular assistance provided to Julian in the Ecuadorian embassy. And certainly New Zealand and Australian citizens both very much feel that our governments are vassal states. They are the servants of US empire. So is really, realistically, being an Australian citizen going to make that much difference?
I think it will, in that it will keep his profile high. Like I say, if he had been a citizen of Somalia or Yemen or Algeria, he would disappear and no one would ever think about him again. But because he's so high profile and he's Australian, the Australian government is compelled to at least pretend that it wants to.
Yes, to pretend, exactly.
Dan Ellsberg makes a very, very important point here. He's exactly right, that this is a test case. And I think that we got an indication of that in the very beginning when then CIA Director Mike Pompeo, who's currently Secretary of State, said that WikiLeaks was a hostile foreign intelligence service. Can you imagine that? Think of those words, a hostile foreign intelligence service, like Iran or North Korea.
They said said non-state, hostile non-state intelligence service.
Yeah. Non-state. Well, Al-Qaeda is a non-state actor. ISIS is a non-state actor. They collect intelligence. This is what he's comparing WikiLeaks to. Well, we all know WikiLeaks is a journalistic organization. Everybody knows that. They're just pretending that that's not the case. And so they're going to treat WikiLeaks as though it's a hostile non-state actor. Now, in the event that a US jury, again, in the Eastern District of Virginia, most likely, decides that that's the case, then it's going to be open season on every journalist. Think back to the days of the Obama administration. Those were dark days for liberty, personal liberties and civil rights, in that it was the Obama administration that went through James Rosen's notes. This is a Fox News journalist, and accused him of being party to the leak of classified information, and then identified him as an unindicted co-conspirator. This is a journalist doing his job, is described as an unindicted co-conspirator. You don't forget that it was the Obama administration that ordered authorities to raid the home of a Washington Times journalist and to steal her notes from a locked cabinet because they thought that she might have uncovered some kind of wrongdoing in the military. So little by little, the Obama administration pushed that notion that the press was hostile, that the press was too well protected by legal precedent, and that they were going to start dismantling that.
But they lost. But they lost. Each time they tested it in court, ultimately they had to back down, they lost. So,
yes, but
so when you say Julian is a test case, what you mean is that this is their chance to maybe not lose.
Yes. Because look, they have nothing to lose by charging Julian. I mean, if they lose the case, okay, well, they're back where they started. That doesn't mean that they've been pushed back in terms of policy. If they win, they set a new precedent and everybody's in danger.
So when will the press wake up to that fact? Do you think it's starting to happen? There has been some murmurs from some journalists that seem to be thinking Ryan Grimm, DC Bureau Chief of the Intercept's comments last week. Some of them seem to be having a self-reflective moment and thinking, maybe this isn't like such a great idea for us to cheerlead this on. However, I talked to Peter Lavelle earlier, who said he does not believe that we will see the day that the New York Times and Washington Post crowd are championing Julian's cause, in order to protect press freedom as a whole. Do you think that we'll reach that watershed moment or not?
Well, let's look at what the US press did with Ed Snowden, how they treated Ed Snowden. The New York Times eventually, after a period of about 4 years, called for Ed Snowden to be pardoned on its editorial page. The Washington Post, another newspaper of record here in the United States, called for Snowden to be prosecuted for treason. That's a death penalty charge. The Los Angeles Times editorial board wrote editorials taking both positions. He should be pardoned, he should be charged and tried and convicted. So when the owners of these newspapers, the publishers and editors of these newspapers, either can't come down on one side or the other, or come down on the wrong side, I think that we ought to fear for Julian's safety.
And very much, I think we saw that extended to what you're describing, extended to the UK press as well, as I remember.
The UK press is even worse, to tell you the truth. Yeah, I think the UK press is worse because so much of it is so conservative. And then even The Guardian. I have to say I'm disappointed in The Guardian vis-a-vis Ed Snowden, because The Guardian was a recipient of Snowden's largesse, as was the Washington Post. And they both turned on him. I don't understand that at all.
John, have you ever met Julian?
Once by Skype at a Ron Paul event a year or so ago.
Really? I must have seen that. I've seen Julian on Ron Paul, but I didn't recall you guys being there together. But it was an event rather than Ron Paul's show, you're saying?
Yeah, it was an event out at the Dulles Expo Center in Virginia. I just happened to be sitting in the front row, and there happened to be a camera pointed at me, and Julian said, "Oh, there's John Kiriakou." And I said, "Hi, Julian, how are you?" And that was it.
Because I know he's a huge fan of your work, and I know the WikiLeaks as a whole is a huge fan of your work and of your sacrifice.
I am of theirs. You know, look where we would be without WikiLeaks. We wouldn't have any idea that the U.S. government was spying on American citizens. We wouldn't have any idea. Thanks to Ed Snowden and WikiLeaks, we now know what NSA does. And it's now, after 5 years, that the Congress is finally starting to focus on these different provisions in the Patriot Act and in the FISA Act as being anti-democratic and as being anti-civil liberties. And it's only because of Ed Snowden and WikiLeaks. Go back farther, and let's talk about Chelsea Manning. The complaint in the press was that Chelsea Manning had released so many State Department cables, and it showed people's identities, et cetera, et cetera. It's irrelevant. We know now that there was no negative fallout from the release of those cables. What's important is that Chelsea Manning released video evidence of a war crime. And we would have no idea.
For which there has been no...
That's right.
Right, like to this day, the people who are involved in that are at large.
They are. They're free. But at least we know about it. And that's because of WikiLeaks. And so what we need is more people passing information to WikiLeaks. Look, you know, let's say the definition of whistleblowing again, because I think this is so important. This is actually a legal definition here in the United States. Whistleblowing is bringing to light any evidence of waste, fraud, abuse, illegality, or threats to the public health or public safety. Okay? There's no downside to that. There's no downside to whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is only a positive event for the public. And so we need more people cooperating with WikiLeaks, not fewer.
Do you think that WikiLeaks releases have made anybody inside the military or the intelligence services think twice about their actions?
Oh, I do. I do. When you shine light into the darkness, everybody reacts. You know, let's look at the Chicago black site, the Chicago police black site. You know, when this reporting first appeared in the US press, most people didn't believe it. They thought it was some kind of a hit job, a hit piece on the Chicago police. Because if there had been a black site here inside the United States, people would have known about it. Well, nobody knew about it. And we only learned about it because of an intrepid reporter who told us. And so changes were made. People were prosecuted. I can't help but to think that because of WikiLeaks, people say to themselves, maybe I ought not to abuse this prisoner, because what happens if it leaks? Maybe I ought not to participate in this, whatever this illegality is, because it might be released to the press. It might find its way to WikiLeaks. So that's only a good thing. And I'll say one other thing about WikiLeaks, and I say this all the time in press interviews. People ask me if they have information, sensitive information, classified information, government information, and they want it to get out, but they want to do it anonymously, who should they send it to? And interviewers always say, well, you know, the New York Times has an encryption key on their website, and so does the Post, and so does the Intercept. No. You can't trust those journalistic outlets to protect your identity. We already have seen what the Intercept has done with people's identities over the years, at least 3 times. The only place to go is WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is the only organization, literally the only organization that has consistently protected the identities of its sources. Only WikiLeaks.
John, I know that UK Cage, the organization UK Cage, are also big fans of WikiLeaks, and they say they're on their Twitter account. They say they're working to empower communities impacted by the war on terror and to promote due process. They number amongst them Guantanamo, ex-Guantanamo prisoners and people victims of rendition. I'm interested to know, can you cite any examples within WikiLeaks files that have included revelations specifically about rendition?
Yeah, there have been a couple. Actually, I've taken calls from British journalists several times asking me about renditions through Diego Garcia. And before WikiLeaks, nobody knew that there were renditions through Diego Garcia, and nobody knew, and this is even more important, nobody knew that the British were involved. So that was a great service, I think, that WikiLeaks provided to the British people.
To date, has there been any comeuppance as a result of the rendition? I mean, has it in any way, has anyone ever been held accountable? Has there been has it inhibited the programs at all? I mean, I did some study into rendition, I think a year or 2 back, and I discovered that there was something like 40 countries that had been involved in it, including like India and Kazakhstan, and like Brazil was one of them, actually.
Yeah, it's terrible, isn't it? I've been out of the CIA for a long time. I left 14 years ago now. But it's my understanding that, yes, this has had an impact on the program. Extraordinary rendition now is something that's very, very unusual. And it's because light has been shined on it. It's because the information has gotten out. And these countries don't want to be held accountable. So it's better for them just to not participate in extraordinary rendition anymore than to do it and keep their fingers crossed and hope that it remains secret. Again, anytime light is shined on this darkness, it's a good thing. because changes are made, even if those changes are incremental. Changes are made. You know, we always say, Suzie, that governments always take the long-term view. They know that they're going to be there forever. They know that they can outweight most of their opponents. Well, you know what? So can we. We can fight this thing forever. We can fight it year after year after year because we know we're right. And so if we look at the long term like governments do, we're going to win this thing in the end.
Nuremberg, and you know, even what we've been pursuing Nazi regime stalwarts for into their 90s. It would be very nice to think that one day some of these guys, even in their 90s, might actually be held to account. We've had a long discussion on this stream with other guests about how WikiLeaks is revealing the crimes, but these crimes appear to be perpetrated with impunity from the street level and like everyday police violence to the nation state level. And you know, the subversions of democracy, be it voter fraud or you know other revelations that have been made about political fraud, to the international law arena, where the UN has twice ruled in Julian Assange's favour. The Inter-American Court on Human Rights has ruled in Julian Assange's favour, and yet the US and the UK just basically thumb their nose at international law and at those findings. How do we get from transparency to accountability?
Another good question. Accountability, I think, is going to have to come from individual judges. You remember when Augusto Pinochet was indicted in, I think it was Spain, a decade or so ago. It was because of one courageous Spanish judge and one courageous Spanish prosecutor. We know that the US is going to thumb its nose at international law like it always has, and so will the UK. They know they can get away with it. There's never any consequence. There's never any price to pay. So what we need is to encourage individual prosecutors and judges. Now, we know that they're out there. We know that for example, there's a prosecutor in Berlin who's considering charges against Gina Haspel, the new CIA director for crimes against humanity, for her role in the so-called war on terror. We need more people like that. It's no accident that George Tenet, the former CIA director, has never made an overseas trip since he left that position. He knows what he's doing. He knows there's a risk of being arrested and charged with horrible, terrible crimes if he leaves the country. Well, what we need to do is to make them fearful. We need to ensure that they're fearful by encouraging these prosecutors and judges to file charges. File heavy charges, crimes against humanity, war crimes, human rights offenses. We need to hold them accountable. And the UN can't, so the individuals must.
Interestingly, there's a Snowden cable that talks about how in the war in Bosnia, the military chain of command made generals sign off on bombing orders because they were concerned about war crimes accusations. And so they created this system where at the topmost levels, they had to authorize everything because they knew that that would indemnify those generals. Whereas if the mid or lower ranked people were the ones signing off on it, there was a very real chance that they actually would be held accountable. And just back to the renditions topic, there was, of course, the Italian affair, which you could probably tell us about, where there was actually a prosecution.
Oh boy, was there. Yeah, before I get to that, let me give you one little factoid. When I reached a certain level at the CIA in terms of seniority, I was offered several different kinds of insurance. So for $2 a year, I bought, it was called dread disease insurance. You know, you work in these horrible places around the world, you're going to catch something. And I did several times. Well, that dread disease insurance for $2 a year covered everything that my regular health insurance didn't. I was also given legal insurance. So for another $6 a year, if I were ever to be implicated in a war crime or a crime against humanity, the CIA would pay all of my legal expenses. Now that was a relatively new development. That's a post 9/11 development. And it's because they knew they were involved in war crimes and crimes against humanity. And so at the very least, what they can do for their employees is pay for their legal expenses. Now, the Milan affair, this ought to be taught as a class at the CIA on how not to conduct a rendition operation. There was an Egyptian national in Milan, Abu Omar. Abu Omar was a firebrand Muslim cleric who would give very tough anti-American sermons after Friday prayers in the mosque in Milan. Well, the CIA decided that he was a threat and he was probably Al-Qaeda, he was probably a terrorist, we needed to shut him down. And so they sent a team of, I think it was like a dozen people to Milan, and they surveilled him for several weeks, and they realized that he kept a schedule, and he left his apartment every single day at the same time, and he walked to the mosque. So they set up in a van on the route from his apartment to the mosque, and one day, as he was walking past the van, they opened the side door very quickly, they snatched him, and they kidnapped him. They bundled him onto a plane, and they flew him to Egypt. In Egypt, he was tortured mercilessly, right? And we know that because he was totally innocent of anything. And the Egyptians finally came back to the US and said, listen, this is either the wrong guy or he's just innocent. And they had to let him go. And now he gives interviews and he'll show you the marks from his torture. Well, the Italians were outraged by this because here's the US government carrying out a criminal action on Italian soil without anybody's permission, like we own the place. And so the Italians were compelled to prosecute these dozen or so CIA officers. Well, almost all of them were operating under pseudonym, right? Not operating under their real names, except for Robert Lady, who was the chief of base in Milan. Robert Lady was charged with several serious crimes. He ended up fleeing, and he retired in Panama. The Italians asked the Panamanians to extradite him, and they briefly arrested him. But then under heavy pressure from the US, they let him go, and then he moved to the US just for his own safety. Now, these other CIA officers made mistakes, every one of them. For example, if you are operating overseas under pseudonym, don't use your credit card that's in your real name to buy souvenirs. What's wrong with you? Are you stupid? Another one, if you're operating under pseudonym, don't call your wife at night to see how she's doing. What you need to do is buy a phone card, find an anonymous random telephone booth, and then call. Don't call from your hotel. And so the Italians very easily were able to identify every single one of these CIA officers. And they indicted them all. Well, one of them is actually a dual US Portuguese citizen. And she was visiting her mother in Portugal. And the Italian authorities asked the Portuguese to arrest her, which they did. And they held her for extradition. Her case went up to the Supreme Court of Portugal, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government. And so she was extradited to Italy for trial. Now, these are charges of kidnapping. We're talking 10, 20 years in prison for this. Well, of course, as soon as this happened, Barack Obama put ridiculous pressure on the Italians, and the Italians pardoned her and released her. She was the only one that even came close to facing justice. Everybody else got away with it scot-free.
But probably would be thinking twice next time, you would hope.
You have to think twice. You know, there are so many examples, Suzie, of the CIA grabbing the wrong person. Look at Maher Arar. Talk about somebody who was wronged. This is a professor at the University of Toronto who was snatched from a plane at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York and sent to Syria for torture. He was tortured for a year and a half. And finally, the Syrians came back and said, this is the wrong guy. And it was the wrong guy. He ended up suing the Canadian government. He got a $6 million settlement. But the US, as policy, never apologizes. We don't settle and we don't apologize. I felt compelled to apologize to the guy on behalf of my own government because of the way he was wronged. And there are half a dozen examples like that.
There is a article, an opinion piece written, I think last week, from a long-time Guantanamo detainee. I think he's been there 14, 15, 16 years. He was a taxi driver in Karachi, and they snatched him and shipped him off to Afghanistan, and then on to Guantanamo Bay and tortured him, held him without trial. It's the most gut-wrenching testimony, actually, when you read through it. He talks about the types of torture that were used on him and the total bleakness of living in a situation where you can't even receive a sentence. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. You can't defend yourself, but you also can't even have, even if they gave him 20 years, at least he'd know in 20 years he's getting out. They don't even get that.
No, they've actually coined a term for it at the CIA. It's called learned helplessness. That's the goal. The goal is to make you conclude that you're utterly helpless and you just break. That's what they want to happen. They want to make you crazy. So you're right. They snatch so many people. A vast majority of the people who've passed through Guantanamo have been completely innocent of any crime. They were just snatched right off the streets. For example, if you and I are from the same village in Afghanistan and I owe you money and I don't want to pay you your money back, I go to the nearest American and I say, hey, see that guy over there? He's Al-Qaeda. They snatch you up. They give me $150 reward. They send you to Guantanamo. Nobody ever sees you again. And I don't have to pay back that loan. That happened all the time.
It's sickening. I'm just amazed. I don't actually know how humanity got to a place where not only is this happening, but we know it's happening and it's continuing to happen. I mean, how long has Guantanamo been open now? We can't claim ignorance.
Right.
We can't pretend that we don't know.
I remember the first time I ever heard about Guantanamo, I was serving in Pakistan, and we had captured dozens of Al-Qaeda fighters as they were coming across the border from Afghanistan after the bombing of Tora Bora. And I remember loading them onto the plane, and I said to one of the Air Force guys, where are you taking them? And he said, Guantanamo. And I said, the base at Guantanamo in Cuba? And he said, yeah. He said, they came up with this really great idea. We send them to Guantanamo, and we hold them there for a couple of weeks until we can get them processed in US courts around the country. And then we fly them to the US to go on trial. And I said, oh, that is a great idea. Well, then along the line, somebody decided, no, we're not going to give them any rights. We're not going to put them on trial. We're going to make them sit here for the rest of their lives until they either commit suicide or just give up. And a lot of them commit suicide.
And yet so do US troops in Iraq and elsewhere.
And that ought to be a lesson for all of them.
What an amazing outcome that you have both the prisoners and in some cases the guards committing suicide. How much our governments have to answer for is absolutely remarkable.
And getting back to WikiLeaks then, it's only because of WikiLeaks that there is even a hint that there could be justice. Because without WikiLeaks, we wouldn't even know most of these stories.
Absolutely. And if information is power, then if there is ever to be any accountability, then the information is the first step to that. The awareness is the first step to that. I haven't really had a chance to speak with you about it. I did tell you a little bit on the phone, but one ray of light in my life at the moment, and hopefully in Julian's, is that over the course of the last 2 weeks, this movement has become more than just a series of online vigil events. It has become a daily coordinated action group on a platform that we developed that amazingly attracted 2,600 volunteer signups in the first 4 days. It's been around for about 10 days now and is producing incredible content and now moving towards on-the-ground actions. Do you have hope that initiatives like that, where people can put aside their politics, turn away from the divide and conquer agenda, and collaborate to free Julian, that maybe this, if international law isn't going to work and if diplomacy is non-existent, can we together make a difference?
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yes. I'm very fortunate to work with a guy named Brian Becker. Brian is one of the founders of an organization that does large-scale actions, demonstrations, sit-ins, protests. It's called the Answer Coalition. And his work in the anti-war movement it's positively inspirational. Well, Brian and I talk about Julian all the time, along with Diani Barreto and Randy Credico and other supporters of Julian. And Brian is confident that once we move this into the streets, we can have an impact. He's able to, and I've actually seen this with my own eyes, he's able to say, I think I'm going to file a petition to close XYZ Street in Washington in 2 weeks for a march. And then somehow 50,000 people turn up. How he's able to organize that, I have no idea, but I've seen it with my own eyes. And I know that if he can do it, we can do it. And certainly he would help us do it. But yeah, I think we can have an honest to God impact if we take to the streets. And you're right, our government isn't going to help us do anything. And I don't trust the media to help us do anything. We have to do it ourselves.
Sadly, nor are the NGOs doing much about it either.
No.
They seem to react belatedly to where there is existing large-scale public pressure rather than helping to create that large-scale public pressure.
Yeah, where's the ACLU in all this? And why isn't the ACLU filing charges on behalf of WikiLeaks and Julian? Or cases, rather. I'm disappointed.
I have no answer for that, but I have noticed that the statements from HRW and others seem to turn up when there is a ramping up in the public discourse in support of Julian and WikiLeaks, which is really disappointing because I would expect those NGOs to lead the charge on these issues and not just to be reactionary.
Well, when I was arrested, they ran screaming from the room. I got literally no help from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, or the ACLU. Nothing. So if I were Julian, I wouldn't.
Did they eventually come to the party, though?
Eventually.
Once you had a high enough profile that it becomes beneficial to them to associate themselves with you.
Eventually, Human Rights Watch did. And then it was only thanks to Ai Weiwei that Amnesty International finally came around. And it was because Weiwei identified me as a political prisoner and then did my portrait out of Legos for the Smithsonian Institution. And then finally Amnesty said, well, okay, I guess he was a political prisoner after all. Yeah, it was disgusting.
Well, I very much think that it's time for us to move past any expectation or dependency on these institutional powers and to become the force to be reckoned with ourselves. And that's very much what we're trying to do. And we've only been able to do it because very principled, brave people like yourself stood up immediately when Julian was cut off, when he was effectively put into solitary, when he was cut off from communication with everyone. You were among the first 15 people that within hours of that happening came and jumped on the stream and were publicly advocating for him. So thank you for being one of the real people that you don't wait for a paycheck or public credit or anything. You are there out of solidarity, and full props to you for that, John.
It's not worthy of thanks. It's the least I could do.
Well, I certainly am very grateful to you for that, because we could not have built anything that we have without all those amazing people behind the scenes, and yourself and the other guests in front of the scenes who've been pulling together for Julian. And I have been told that the existence of this movement and the groundswell of support that's coming his way is giving him some strength in the horrific circumstances that he finds himself in. So
Good.
it's pretty
Yeah,
special. Pretty
good.
special. Do you have any last message for the viewers or for Julian?
Keep up the fight. You know, it's easy to feel powerless when you consider yourself to be just one individual, but you're not just one individual. This is a movement, and there are people all around the world that are with us. And so we have to keep this fight up and not relent. It's only just begun. This is going to take a long time.
Well, we are doing our best, and we're certainly starting to see some results in a short time frame, which I'm very impressed at, because I do understand that this is a long someone's phone. Okay, thank you so much, Mr. John Kiriakou, absolute legendary whistleblower. You honor us and Julian with your presence. Thank you so much for being here.
Very, very best of luck. Thank you.